Corinthian Christians were the black sheep of the early apostolic church. So many problems were happening in the city of Corinth with the early church, probably because Corinth was a port city and there's all sorts of wild people running around in port cities. And this is the second epistle that we have in the Bible from Paul to the Corinthians. We've already done 1 Corinthians. We now turn to 2 Corinthians. But we see in 2 Corinthians that there were at least 4 epistles that Paul wrote to the Christians in Corinth. We only have 2 of those epistles. We'll look at why that is and some of the evidence for the other epistles. But today we'll focus on the false apostles who are coming into the church in Corinth and stirring up controversy, stirring up hatred against Paul. And then we'll also look at this mysterious passage towards the end of the epistle where Paul talks about his heavenly visions and the thorn in his flesh. So let's get started. The author is Paul and Timothy, and no one doubts that this epistle, second epistle to the Corinthians, is an authentic writing of St. Paul. It was written around the year AD 57, and the messenger for this epistle is Titus, who was accompanied by 2 others. We read this in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 16 through 24. So Paul, Timothy, and Titus are all involved in these problems with the Christian church in Corinth. Now, what's the historical context for these epistles? Okay, so Paul had founded the Catholic Church in Corinth around the year AD 52 on his second missionary journey. You can read about this in Acts 18. Now, Paul, as I mentioned in the intro, wrote at least 4 epistles, letters, to Corinth during this 5-year period. So from 52, when he started the church, to about 57, which is when this second Corinthians is written. Now, there was a proto-Corinthians, as scholars have called it, or a warning letter. This is referred to in 1 Corinthians 5:9, where he says, I have written to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Sexual immorality, as we have seen, is a major problem in Corinth. Why? It's a port city. There are lots of prostitutes, lots of sexual immorality going on in Corinth. So, not surprising, that's a problem. But in 1 Corinthians 5:9, we see that he's already written at least 1 letter to them previously. Then we have the next letter, which is 1 Corinthians. It wasn't the first epistle Paul wrote to them, but it's the first one we have in the Bible, so we call it 1 Corinthians. And then there's what's known as the letter of tears. Now, Paul refers to this, quote, letter of tears, is what he calls it, in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Also again in chapter 7, verse 8. And 1 Corinthians does not match the description of the letter of tears. You don't read 1 Corinthians and think this is a letter of tears. So there's another epistle snuggled in here, and this is the letter of tears, and it falls between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. So 2 Corinthians isn't the immediate follow-up to 1 Corinthians. It's actually the second follow-up. And then we have this epistle that we're studying today, which is 2 Corinthians. It would be the 4th one in this series of epistles that are coming from Paul. And presumably there are letters coming from Corinth to Paul. There's an exchange going back and forth because Paul is answering questions and addressing issues. Now, briefly, some people have suggested that 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 11, 12, and 13 is in fact the letter of tears, because it's very stern, it's very reproachful against the Corinthian Christians. So that could be the tearful letter that's attached to the end. I'm open to that theory. Others say that the letter of tears is lost in its entirety. I think that's probably the safest and most traditional answer, but it is notable that the tail end of 2 Corinthians is pretty harsh, pretty reproachful, and maybe it's the letter of tears. Now, what are the problems going on in 2 Corinthians? Again, there's a 4-letter sequence. This is the 4th and final one that we have. First of all, Paul as an apostle is being doubted. Remember, Paul is not one of the original 12 apostles. In a sense, he's the 13th apostle. And there are other men who claim to be apostles. In fact, they claim to be what Paul calls super apostles. And they are saying that Paul, don't listen to Paul. He's not really an apostle, or he's a lower apostle. We're super apostles. Listen to us. So that's one issue that Paul has in Corinth. Not only are they acting crazy and sinful, they no longer are trusting in Paul's authority. The other problem, which we have seen in almost all the epistles of Paul, is that the church in Corinth is being tempted to follow the Judaizing heresy. The Judaizing heresy is that Christians who are baptized need to be circumcised, they need to follow all the laws of Moses, they need to keep kosher laws. In other words, Christians need to become Jews, observing the ceremonial law. Paul says by baptism, you don't have to do that. And it seems that the super apostles are also teaching the Judaizing heresy, which becomes manifest later on, for example, in chapter 11. So those are the problems that are going on in 2 Corinthians. Let's now look at the outline of Paul's structure for 2 Corinthians. As normal, he begins with a greeting. He talks about his change in plan. Remember, Paul's not in prison. He's going around doing his missionary work. He talks about his delayed visit. And he talks about, remember in 1 Corinthians, there was a man who was sleeping with his father's wife, presumably his stepmother. He talks about how that man has become penitent and has been restored. So this is the first example of excommunication in the Bible. And it shows that excommunication isn't just to be mean to somebody. Excommunication is there to bring people to repentance and bring them back into the life of grace, back to the path of salvation. Now, in chapter 2, Paul defends his dignity and his integrity as an apostle of Jesus Christ. He uses the words triumphant, accredited, glorious, honest, suffering. He goes on to talk about being hopeful, devoted, reconciling, and being approved. And then Paul appeals to the Corinthian Christians themselves to open their hearts, to be separate from the world. And he talks about the comfort and the confidence that they have given him in the early days. Back in the good old days when he founded the church and they were on fire for Christ and they were living in unity and living in peace. He also talks about his instruction for collecting money, alms, for the church in Jerusalem. The church in Jerusalem is being persecuted. It's fallen into poverty. And so Paul wants to bring them a gift from the Gentiles. And then we move into the harsh part of 2 Corinthians. This is the part that where he begins again. This is why some people think that 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 is the letter of tears, because he starts, I, Paul. It's almost like he's starting over again. It could be now he's revved up. He kind of did all this other stuff, and now he's like, okay, now I'm going to really give it to you. Or it could be the letter of tears. It's hard to say. I'm going to go with the traditional view and say this is all one letter. So he begins, I, Paul. Chapter 11, he talks about the infamous super apostles. And he calls them false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. So he doesn't like these guys. He's saying they're not even apostles. They're false apostles. Now, St. John Chrysostom, early church father, we love him here at the New St. Thomas Institute, quote him all the time in our lessons and in our writings. He states that the super apostles that Paul's upset about are in fact Peter, James, and John, the real apostles. I just wanted to bring this up because it's a minority position. Most people in the church fathers don't say that. But John Chrysostom says, hey, these are the real apostles, and Paul's having problems with them. And he's calling them false apostles sort of an irony. They really are apostles. They're just having problems with one another over this Jew-Gentile stuff. I don't think that's the right call, because look at the words Paul's using. False apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. You don't say that about Peter the Pope or about James or John, the beloved disciple who wrote the Gospel of John. This is not the language of inner Christian dialogue, right? This is heresy versus orthodoxy, heretic versus apostle. So he goes on in 11 and he says, but whatsoever anyone dares to boast of, he says, I am speaking of a fool. He's saying, look, I know I'm getting ridiculous. These guys are bragging, so guess what? I'm going to brag a little bit. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I, Paul says. Are they Israelites? So am I, says Paul. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman, with far great labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. So Paul says, look, if you want someone who's Jewish, I'm Jewish. I studied and worked at the temple. I killed Christians for the sake of my love for Judaism. That's how hardcore I was. So don't let these people say that I'm not really Jewish. Paul's saying, I'm speaking like a madman here. He says, look, when it comes to labor, I've done more than them. When it comes to being imprisoned and then put in jail, it's happened to me more often. I've been beaten, and I've often come near death. And then Paul goes into this very interesting description of his mystical journey to heaven. Paul is a mystic, and in chapter 12, he describes him going to paradise, going to what he calls the third heaven. And he does it in the third person, but he kind of slips up and goes into the first person, so we know it's Paul. Chapter 12, Paul. He says, quote, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And I know that this man was caught up to paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except for my weakness. Though if I wish to boast, I shall not be a fool, for I shall be speaking of the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. And to keep me from being too elated by the abundance of revelation, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being too elated. I'm going to pause here. So clearly, the man who 14 years ago, who went up to the third heaven, to paradise, is the same man who is receiving this thorn of flesh, aka Paul himself. Paul's kind of playing these games like, I don't want to brag, but I do want to brag. I'm talking like a madman. Okay, if they want to boast, I'll boast even more. Hey, you want to talk about visions? I've been all the way up to heaven. Whether in the body or in the body, I'm not really sure, but I've been all the way up to heaven. All right, and so in order to keep him humble, God has given him the thorn of the flesh. And he calls it a messenger of Satan to harass him and to keep him from being prideful. Verse 8, 3 times I besought the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I will all the more gladly boast of my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. End quote. This is St. Paul. This is Paul transformed by Jesus. Jesus didn't come with power and strength. He came with humility and with weakness, and ultimately gave himself on the cross, a bloody mess, despised by men, and yet beloved by God and raised on the third day. Paul is living the mystery of Jesus Christ with insults and persecutions and with beatings. And yet, to keep him humble, God has given him this thorn in the flesh. So what is this thorn in the flesh? Well, the church fathers, scholars today, everybody has sought to figure out what this is. And the honest answer is no one knows. Why? Because Paul didn't tell us. But here are some of the options that have come up over time. The thorn itself is persecution and ridicule. That there are these false apostles that travel church to church. Paul starts the churches, and then a year or so later, these missionary preachers come along like, Paul's a fool. Don't listen to him. Hey, do all this. So maybe that's the thorn in his flesh. Tertullian, the church father, he said that it was ear or head pain, which might be an ancient way of referring to migraines. This is what Paul, and how did Tertullian get this? Was it an oral tradition? I don't know. That's what Tertullian says. It could have been his loss of eyesight, and he mentioned this in Galatians, and the early church knew of this, that he was losing his eyes. Another theory is that he had a speech impediment. In 2 Corinthians, he talks about how he's not the best speaker, that these super apostles and others are better in the pulpit. You know, they give better messages. Paul writes great letters, but he's kind of weak in person, is the rumor. So maybe he has a speech impediment. I doubt that one because it seems like it was something given to him after he had these visions. So you wouldn't get a speech impediment later in life, maybe. One theory is that he had epilepsy, or he got epilepsy later. A sign for this is that he calls it a messenger from Satan. And often in antiquity, epilepsy was seen as something demonic. You see that in the Gospels as well. Sometimes it is demonic, sometimes it's not. Perhaps Paul had epilepsy. Martin Luther suggested that it was temptation to deny Christ. He had this constant temptation to not believe in Jesus and just give it all up. But that was the thorn. You can see why Martin Luther would believe that, because Martin Luther believes in faith alone. The only thing about being a Christian is faith alone. So the worst thing you could do as a Christian was deny faith alone. So that was what Martin Luther thought was the thorn. I doubt that. Others in the modern era have said that Paul's thorn in the flesh is a sexual temptation, some sort of perversion. We know that St. Paul was not married, and so people have suggested all kinds of crazy things. I don't think it's that either. I think it's probably a physical malady, is my opinion, like eyesight or migraines, or it is tying into everything that he said before. It is this constant persecution, this constant undermining of him as an apostle, and the highlighting of his weaknesses. In conclusion, I want to focus on Paul and his criticism. You know, we today think of, man, Apostle Paul, he wrote so much of the New Testament. He's so profound. You know, we look at Romans, we look at 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, these powerful works of theology that are so early and testify to the dignity and the deity of Jesus Christ. But it's a reminder to us that even in the early church, someone as great as St. Paul was constantly criticized, constantly undermined. And we see that in the Catholic Church today, where there's great saints like someone like Padre Pio, who was constantly criticized, constantly undermined. And this happens so much in the life of all the saints. I think of St. Therese the Little Flower. I think of St. Francis of Assisi, who was constantly persecuted. Even Thomas Aquinas was persecuted for his theology and his philosophy in his life. So if this is something that we experience as Christians, we shouldn't lose heart. We shouldn't despair. We should be like, oh, I'm just joining the cloud of witnesses. I'm being criticized. Even Paul was constantly criticized. And then the second thing is a practical application that I would encourage you to apply to your own life, and that is what Paul calls strength and weakness. We become weak so that the strength and power of Christ becomes manifest. Often we wonder, why did I get this cancer? Why did I get this disease? Why did I lose my job? Why did this happen to me? And Paul says that Christ can work most powerfully in our own weakness. That our own weakness is not something to be ashamed of, but is actually something, as Paul would say, to boast, but to boast in Jesus Christ. Because it's in this weakness that God perfects strength and power. Paul was able to produce these magnificent letters in his theology out of his own personal weakness, because Christ's hand was upon him. So don't fear weakness, embrace weakness and unite it with the cross, because great power is there. And also don't fear criticism. In fact, if you're receiving criticism, you're probably on the way to being a saint, maybe even a canonized saint. So thanks for being a member of the New St. Thomas Institute and following us in this journey with 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And we'll move on to the rest of St. Paul's lessons in the videos to come. God bless.